Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we take your questions, dig into the sources, and basically pull out the key insights for you.
Yeah, think of it as your cheat sheet to being well-informed without having to wade through everything yourself.
And today we've got a great question, one that seems simple at first glance. When you purchase a DVD movie, what do you own?
Right. It seems like it should have an easy answer, but as we started looking into it, it really spirals out, doesn't it?
It really does. So our mission today is to unpack that. What are you actually getting when you hand over money for that disc? We're talking intellectual property, licenses.
And even sort of the nature of ownership itself in this, digital and physical mix.
Okay, so let's start basic. The physical disc. The plastic, the metal layer, the label, that's mine, right?
Absolutely. That physical object.
Right.
It's your property. You can, use it as a coaster, frisbee it, whatever. The physical thing is yours.
Okay, fair enough. But that's not really what I bought it for. I bought it for the movie on the desk. Do I own that?
Yeah. And that's the crucial distinction. No, you don't own the movie itself. The movie, no. The actual creative work, the images, the sound, the story, that's intellectual property. It's protected by copyright.
So what do I get then?
What you get is a license. Basically, permission from the copyright holder to watch that movie.
A license, like a driver's license. I don't remember signing anything when I bought, Space Jam at the store.
No, it's not like that. It's usually an implied license. You don't sign a piece of paper.
Implied how?
By the very act of buying the DVD under the standard terms of sale, you're implicitly agreeing to the copyright owner's conditions.
Which are?
Generally, you can watch it privately, like at home with family or friends. But you can't legally do things like make copies to sell or give away.
Okay, that makes sense.
Or broadcast it, show it publicly. Like, you can't charge admission for a screening in your backyard.
Right.
Or modify the movie itself.
Right.
Unless maybe some very limited fair use thing applies, but that's a whole other can of worms.
So, bottom line, own the disc, license the movie content. It's like I buy the key, but I don't own the house. I just have permission to go inside sometimes.
That's a pretty good analogy, yeah. You own the container, the disc, but you're licensed to access the content inside under specific rules. You get the license to watch, not the rights to control the film.
But where does this invisible license actually, live? Is it written down somewhere I missed?
It's sort of embedded in the whole system. It stems from copyright law itself. The owner of the copyright has the exclusive rights. Selling you the DVD is them granting you a small slice of those rights, the right to private viewing.
So those FBI warnings at the start, that's part of it?
Exactly. Those warnings, the fine print on the box sometimes, they're reminders of the terms of that implied license you agreed to when you bought it. It's the law that enforces it, not a physical contract you hold.
Okay, so I have this disc, this licensed container. What if I get tired of it? Can I sell it at a garage sale, give it to my cousin?
Yes, absolutely. You can do that. That's where something called the first sale doctrine comes in.
First sale doctrine. Sounds official.
It is. Basically, it means once the copyright owner sells a specific physical copy of their work, like that DVD, they can't control what happens to that particular physical copy anymore. The person who bought it owns that object and can sell it, lend it, give it away, whatever.
So the ownership of the physical disc lets me pass it on. Does the license travel with it? If I sell my Space Jam DVD, can the buyer watch it legally?
Yes, exactly. The implied license to watch the movie privately is tied to that specific physical copy. When you sell or give away the disc, the license transfers along with it.
But here's the catch I suspect is coming. If I sell the disc, I can't keep a copy I ripped to my computer, can I?
You nailed it. Nope. When you transfer the physical disc, you're transferring your only license associated with that copy. You give up your right to watch it when you give up the disc. Making a copy and selling the original means you'd have an unlicensed copy, which is infringement.
One disc, one license. Got it.
That's the principle. Ownership of the disc equals the right to personally view that one copy.
Okay, now this leads directly to something you mentioned, making copies. What about making a backup? Just for me, in case the original gets damaged. That feels like something I should be allowed to do with property I own.
It feels like it should be, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But legally? Well, it's murky, especially in the U.S.
How so?
Because of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, the DMCA, DVDs almost always have encryption, right? Copy protection.
Yeah, CSS and all that stuff.
Right. And the DMCA makes it illegal to circumvent those technological protection measures, that encryption, even if you're just making a backup for purely personal use.
Seriously, even if I own the disc and I just want a safety copy.
Legally speaking, yes. The act of breaking the copy protection is the prohibited part. regardless of your intention.
But what about fair use? Doesn't that cover personal backups?
That's the argument people make, and it makes intuitive sense. But the courts haven't definitively said, yes, fair use allows you to break encryption on a DVD for a personal backup. The DMCA's anti-circumvention rules tend to override that, legally.
So technically, ripping a DVD to my hard drive, even when I bought and paid for, is legally questionable.
It's legally risky, yes. While enforcement for purely personal backups is rare, the act itself is technically violating the DMCA. So the safest legal position is you can only have as many playable copies as you have legally acquired physical disks, making that backup involve bypassing protection, which is a problem.
Wow, okay. This feels fundamentally weird. I own the physical object, the plastic and metal. But the pattern on that plastic and metal, which is just a physical configuration, isn't truly mine to interact with.
You've hit the nail on the head. That's the core tension. You own the raw materials, the atoms. You can physically change them, scratch the disk, break it, paint it. But the specific pattern those atoms are arranged in to represent the movie, that pattern embodies the copyrighted expression.
Like a book. I own the paper and ink, but not the story.
Exactly like a book. You own the physical book object, but the sequence of words, the story, is the copyrighted part. With a DVD, you own the plastic medium, but the encoded data forming the movie is the licensed content.
So I can physically inspect my property, the disc?
Sure. Look at it, weigh it, whatever.
But if I try to understand or extract the meaning encoded in its physical form, like decoding the pits and lands, I'm crossing a line into accessing the licensed copyrighted material.
That's generally how the law looks at it, especially if you're bypassing encryption to do so. Think of it as owning the ship, the vessel, but only having a license to access the cargo inside in a very specific way. Messing with the ship is fine. Trying to break into the cargo hold without permission isn't.
Okay, vessel and cargo. I own the vessel, license the cargo. So back to physical alteration. I can definitely smash my DVD with a hammer.
Absolutely. It's your physical property. You can destroy it, melt it, sand it, snap it in half. Go for it.
But the line is altering it in a way that reproduces or accesses the movie.
Precisely. If your alteration is aimed at getting a copy of the movie or bypassing the limits of the license, that's when copyright law kicks in.
So sanding it into dust is fine, but using some high-tech laser scanner to read the pits and reconstruct the movie file, potentially not fine.
Potentially not fine, yes, because the intent and result there is reproducing the protected creative expression, the movie. You can destroy the physical form, but you can't legally copy or reconstruct the protected content without permission.
This feels inconsistent sometimes. What about fonts? Someone told me font designs aren't really copyrighted in the same way. I can see letter A in a specific style and redraw it myself. Right?
That's a really sharp point, and it highlights a quirk, a specific carve-out in U.S. copyright law. You're right. The actual design of a typeface, the shape of the letters, is considered not copyrightable. It falls under something more like industrial design.
So I can copy the look.
You can replicate the appearance of the letters, yes. What is often copyrighted is the font software, the computer code that generates those letter shapes on screen. But the visual design itself, generally not protected by copyright.
But a movie is protected, even though it's also just a pattern on a disc.
Correct. Movies are considered audiovisual works, a core category of copyrightable creative expression. The pattern of pits and lands on the DVD is seen as a fixation of that creative expression. The law basically makes a value judgment. Typeface shapes are functional, utilitarian. Movie images and sounds are creative authorship.
So it's not about the physics of the pattern, but a legal judgment about how much creativity is involved.
Exactly. Fonts are deemed less original creative expression and more useful article or industrial design, while a movie is seen as high creative authorship. It's a legal distinction, not a physical one.
But wait, the way the data, the movie, is stored on the DVD, those pits and lands, that's dictated by the technical standard for DVDs, right? It's not like the filmmaker artistically chose that specific pattern of pits. It's just ones and zeros stored according to a spec.
You're absolutely right. The physical format, the way the binary data is encoded, is a technological necessity based on the DVD standard. It's not an independent creative choice by the filmmaker.
So how can that specific physical pattern be protected as creative expression when it's just the required technical format?
This is where it gets legally tricky again. The law separates the underlying creative work, the movie, from the physical means of fixation, the DVD pattern. It protects the encoded meaning, the movie itself, regardless of the fact that the physical carrier format is standardized or technologically determined.
So the law protects the message, not the medium it's forced into.
In essence, yes. It's a bit of a contradiction. The physical format is necessary and standardized, yet the content encoded in that format is protected as if the format itself were part of the unique expression. Think burning a book versus photocopying the story. Destroying the physical book is one thing. Reproducing the story is another.
Okay, let me try another analogy you brought up. Destroying the disk, hammer, fine. What about using, say, a precision laser or a chemical process? Still destruction, just different tools.
Interesting angle. The law tends to focus less on the tool and more on the intent and the result. If the goal and outcome of using the laser or chemical is simply to render the disk unreadable, just destruction, it's probably fine, same as the hammer. But if the intent is to use those precise tools to read, analyze, or copy the data to get at the protected movie content, especially by bypassing encryption.
Then it's potentially infringement again.
Exactly. It comes back to whether you're just acting on the physical object you own, or if you're trying to access, copy, or reverse engineer the licensed intellectual property encoded on it. Blunt destruction versus surgical deconstruction aimed at copying.
So it boils down to you're allowed to destroy what you own, but maybe not understand what you own if understanding lets you copy it.
That's a cynical but not entirely inaccurate way to put the practical effect of the DMCA in this context. Yes, the focus is heavily on preventing unauthorized reproduction.
Okay, let's circle back to selling the disc. We said when I sell it, I'm transferring the physical object and the implied license to watch.
Correct.
So in a way, I'm acting as a distributor of this license even though I don't own the underlying copyright.
You are, in a limited sense. And the reason that's legal is specifically because of the first sale doctrine. It creates that exception, allowing the owner of a particular legal copy to dispose of it as they see fit, including selling it.
And the license just sticks to the disc. It can't be separated.
Right. The license is tied to that specific, lawfully made physical copy. You can't sell the disc and keep the license, or sell the license separately.
So without the first sale doctrine, every used bookstore, library, garage sale selling DVDs or books would be illegal.
Pretty much, yes. They'd potentially be infringing the copyright holder's exclusive right of distribution. The first sale doctrine is crucial for the entire secondhand market for physical media.
Now, here's a point you raise that really resonates. When I buy a movie, especially physically, I feel like I'm buying permanent access to that movie, not just the specific fragile piece of plastic.
I think that's the common understanding, the expectation most people have.
So what happens if my disc gets horribly scratched? Or if, in 10 years, nobody makes DVD players anymore? Do I just lose access to the movie I paid for?
Legally. Pretty much yes. Your license was tied to that specific disc. If the disc becomes unplayable, or the technology to play it disappears, the law generally doesn't grant you an automatic right to get a replacement copy or migrate it to a new format.
Even though I paid for the movie.
Even though you paid for access via that specific disc.
The law, as it stands, didn't really account for media degradation or technological obsolescence in a consumer-friendly way. Your right was to use that copy. If that copy fails, legally, that's often your problem. There's no inherent right to make a backup or format shift recognized in law, especially with encryption involved.
That feels fundamentally unfair. I paid for the content, but the container fails and I lose the content.
It's a major point of friction. It's like buying a painting that you know is painted with self-fading paint, and you're told you have no right to take a photo of it before it disappears. You paid for something that felt permanent, but you got a temporary permission tied to a fragile medium.
The law treats the container as disposable, but the content inside as something I never fully owned anyway. That's a good summary. You paid for permanence, but received a temporary conditional permission.
And this gets even weirder with digital purchases, right? Where there's no physical container at all.
Oh, absolutely. When you click buy on a digital movie from Amazon or Apple or whoever, you're almost never actually buying the movie file to own forever.
What am I buying then?
You're typically buying a license to access the movie through their specific service or platform for as long as they make it available and under their terms.
So it's basically a long-term rental.
Often, yes.
Yeah.
Legally, it's much closer to a rental or a service agreement than true ownership. You don't own the file in the way you own a physical disc. You can't resell it. And crucially,
Let me guess, they can take it away.
they can. If the service loses the rights to stream that movie, or the service shuts down, or if they decide you violated their terms of service, poof, your purchased movie can disappear from your library.
So I pay full price. Maybe even more than the DVD, for something that isn't mine and can vanish.
That's the reality of a lot of digital ownership. It's a very fragile kind of access. Compared to a DVD, where you physically possess the copy and can resell it, thanks to first sale, digital is often no physical ownership, no resale right, and potentially revocable access.
It's like paying the full price of a car to just borrow it indefinitely, but the lender can take the keys back whenever they feel like it.
That's not a bad analogy for the worst-case scenario with digital licenses, yeah.
You mentioned earlier you can't really own a license, it's permission. Can you elaborate on that? And what about buffering when I stream? Isn't that creating a temporary copy on my device? Could I just buffer the whole movie?
Right, a license isn't property in the traditional sense. It's a grant of permission, usually limited, conditional, and often revocable, especially in digital contexts. Calling it owning a digital movie is really marketing language, not legal reality. It's a privilege, not a right.
And the buffer.
Buffering is generally considered a temporary, transient reproduction that's technically necessary for the licensed stream to function. So that short buffer is usually seen as implicitly permitted by the license to stream.
But what if I tried to, like, intentionally build up a massive buffer the whole 2 hours and then disconnect, hoping to keep it?
Now you're moving from passive, necessary buffering to actively trying to retain a copy beyond the intended temporary viewing. That could potentially be viewed as creating an unauthorized permanent or semi-permanent copy, exceeding the scope of the streaming license. It depends on intent and the technical specifics, but it's definitely legally gray and potentially infringing.
But you also brought up the point nothing is truly permanent. That buffer isn't permanent, my hard drive isn't, the DVD isn't, the sun isn't. So this legal line between temporary and permanent seems kind of arbitrary.
Philosophically, absolutely. On a long enough timeline, everything is temporary. But law has to operate on human timescales and draw practical lines, however imperfect. It needs concepts like permanent copy versus transient reproduction to function, even if physics tells us those are relative terms. The legal line is a human construct for regulation.
It just feels like this whole legal framework is built on a shaky foundation if it ignores the fundamental impermanence of things. Maybe the whole idea of owning fleeting creative expressions forever is the real problem.
Now you're touching on what some call radical copyright skepticism. Thinkers like Lawrence Lessig, Eben Moglen, Pamela Samuelson, they've argued exactly that copyright tries to impose artificial scarcity and permanent ownership onto things, ideas, expressions that are naturally fluid and shareable, especially digitally.
So they'd agree with my point about the buffer, maybe?
They might argue the focus shouldn't be on whether a buffer is temporary or permanent, but on whether the use harms the creator's legitimate interests. There was a case, Cartoon Network VCSC Holdings, about remote DVRs making buffer copies, which the court allowed, but it was very specific. The bigger point is that technology like streaming and AI now constantly pushes against these old legal categories.
This ownership idea is fascinatingly complex. What about, okay, this is maybe out there. What about my DNA? You said I own my physical DNA, but can someone else, like, copyright the sequence if they map it?
That's a really profound question that courts and ethicists are still grappling with. So the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that naturally occurring DNA sequences found in nature, cannot be patented. You can't patent a product of nature.
Okay, so my raw code is safe.
Your raw, unaltered sequence, yes. However, companies can potentially patent synthetically created or significantly modified DNA sequences, cDNA, for example. And the information derived from your DNA sequence, once sequenced and analyzed, gets into complex data privacy and ownership issues, not strictly copyright. But the implication you're hinting at is huge. If your fundamental biological blueprint can be sequenced, analyzed, maybe even modified and patented in some forms, what does ownership of self really mean?
Exactly. And thinking about creation, you mentioned copyright is based on authorship, deliberate creation. But my own conception, like most people's, wasn't some deliberate authorial act. It was biology, maybe even accidental biology.
A powerful point. Human life emerges from biological processes, often without the kind of deliberate, intentional authorship that copyright law envisions for a novel or a film. We are emergent phenomena, not design works in the legal sense.
Right. Sometimes it's the complete opposite of intentional design.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that completely undermines trying to apply traditional intellectual property concepts, which are rooted in rewarding intentional creation, to something as fundamental and often non-authored as biological life and identity. Life itself challenges these legal boxes.
So if I wasn't deliberately authored, Who owns me? Is it me? My parents who initiated the process? Is it God or the universe, if you believe in that? Or is the whole idea of owning a person just wrong?
You're hitting on centuries of philosophical debate there.
Yeah.
Legally and ethically, in most modern societies, the concept of owning another person is abhorrent. We talk about self-ownership. Parental rights are about care and responsibility, not property ownership. Attributing ownership to God or the universe is metaphysical, not legal.
So ownership requires
Yeah,
someone capable of claiming it and enforcing it.
generally, yes. Ownership is a social and legal construct. It requires recognition by others, an authority, like the law, to back it up. It seems less a fundamental truth of the universe and more a set of rules we've collectively agreed upon, for better or worse.
It makes me think of that line from Fight Club. The things you own end up owning you.
That really cuts to the heart of it, doesn't it? Ownership isn't just power. It's responsibility, entanglement, maintenance. The DVD needs a player, the player needs electricity, the movie takes up your time, the possession exerts its own demands back on the possessor. It's a burden as much as a benefit.
And maybe, at the deepest level, the idea of separate things to own is the illusion. You mentioned the universe. Isn't it all just one thing, ultimately, stemming from the Big Bang?
That's a perspective shared by many mystical traditions and increasingly echoed in physics. The idea of fundamental interconnectedness, that all matter and energy originated from a single point and remain entangled. It does challenge our everyday notion of separate ownable objects. Spinoza, Alan Watts, Buddhist thought, Carl Sagan's star stuff, they all point towards this unity.
Okay, so if ownership is fuzzy and the universe is one, let's go back to the license. You said I license access, fine. Then I want that access for as long as I exist. If you're going to use the spirit of the word buy, then give me lasting access.
That's the ethical argument many consumers feel. Yes, if I paid for the content, I should retain access to that content, regardless of the fragility of the medium or the whims of the provider.
And if true, permanent ownership by me is impossible because the universe is temporary and interconnected, then maybe true, permanent ownership by the copyright holder is also impossible for the same reasons, making their claim just as weak as mine.
That's a fascinating philosophical challenge to the very foundations of copyright. If ownership itself is a construct and permanence is an illusion, then perhaps the perpetual exclusive rights granted by copyright are also built on sand. Maybe the focus should shift entirely from ownership to access rights, stewardship, and fair compensation, recognizing the inherently shared nature of culture and ideas.
Okay, let's get practical again for a minute, based on some of the listeners' specific points about the license itself. When do I actually agree to this invisible license? The moment I pay, when I break the shrink wrap, when the FBI warning pops up.
That's often incredibly unclear. Shrink wrap licenses, where opening the package supposedly means you agree, and click wrap licenses, clicking I agree online, have faced legal challenges about whether there was genuine consent and opportunity to review terms before being bound. There isn't one single legally defined moment.
And what if I read the terms on that FBI screen and think, nope, I don't agree to this? Can I take the open DVD back for a refund?
That often depends entirely on the store's return policy. Many stores won't take back open software or media, so you might be in a situation where you can only discover the full terms after you've lost the practical ability to reject them and get your money back. It's a known issue.
What about warranties? Does the seller guarantee the disc will even work on a standard player? What if my player is slightly old or quirky?
There's usually an implied warranty of merchantability that the goods are fit for their ordinary purpose. But sellers often try to disclaim warranties, especially for software and media, in the fine print. If it fails on a standard conforming player, you likely have a claim. If it fails on a non-standard or malfunctioning player, it gets murkier, and the burden might shift to you.
And if the license requires certain technical things, like a specific operating system or player, and I can't meet them, am I still bound by the license I can't even use?
Again, legally complex. If the requirements weren't clear up front before purchase, you might have grounds to void the sale. But if they were disclosed, even in fine print, you might be considered bound, even if you can't comply. It highlights the information asymmetry and potential unfairness in many consumer tech agreements.
It just feels like if I buy the content, I should have a right to get it delivered in a way that actually lets me access it without being forced into agreements with third parties or needing specific hardware I might not have.
That's a strong argument for consumer rights in the digital age. The right to receive what you paid for in a usable, accessible format. Current practices often prioritize the seller's control and distribution chain over the consumer's fundamental ability to simply use the product they purchased.
So if we were to draft like a digital fairness standard based on this logic, what would it include?
Okay, let's brainstorm. Based on your points, Article 1 might be the right to meaningful access. You're guaranteed practical access to the content you paid for, maybe a choice of delivery formats, and definitely clear upfront terms about how long your access lasts. No hidden expirations.
Good. What else?
Article 2. Right to transparent contract terms. All terms, especially licenses and third-party requirements, must be clearly disclosed before purchase. You should have to separately consent to the license, not just by buying the product. No forced bundling of unrelated agreements.
Makes sense. Keep going.
Article 3. Right to merchantable digital goods. The product must be fit for use on standard platforms. The seller is responsible if technical issues prevent access, unless it's clearly your fault. The burden of proof should be on the seller if there's a dispute.
Yes. What about returns?
Article 4. Right to refund or withdrawal. A reasonable period after purchase and accessing the terms to reject the license and get a full refund. And clear rights if the product fundamentally fails later.
Enforcement.
Article 5. Enforcement and penalties. Licenses that don't meet these standards could be deemed void. Penalties for deceptive practices or failing to provide the promised access. Something with teeth.
That sounds a lot more reasonable than the current
It
situation.
addresses many of the contradictions and frustrations we've been discussing, yeah.
Okay, final frontier here. You brought up relativistic travel. Let's go there. If I rent a digital movie for 48 hours and watch it on a spaceship near a black hole where time dilation is extreme,
Right, so hours for you could be years or centuries on Earth where the rental server is.
does that 48-hour limit apply according to my clock or Earth's clock? The contract didn't specify a space-time reference frame.
Huh, that's brilliant. It perfectly highlights the absurdity of applying Earth standard contracts to environments where fundamental physics works differently. Standard rental terms completely fail to account for relativity. There's no clause defining who's 48 hours.
So legally, could I argue I haven't violated the agreement if I watched it for, say, 10 subjective hours, even if 10,000 years passed on Earth?
There's a strong legal principle, contra proferentum, which means ambiguities in a contract are interpreted against the party who drafted it, in this case the rental company. Since they failed to specify Earth Standard Time or Newtonian time, your interpretation based on your proper time could arguably be valid. You adhered to the terms in your frame of reference.
So my interstellar movie marathon might be legally protected?
It's a fantastic hypothetical legal argument. Plus, the practical enforcement is nil. If your device is cruising near Sagittarius A and disconnected from Earth's internet, how are they going to know or enforce the Earth time limit anyway? Their model breaks down.
Amazing. So wrapping this all up, we started asking what you own when you buy a DVD.
And we ended up questioning the nature of ownership, the flaws in copyright law, the unfairness of digital licenses, and even the applicability of contract law across different space-time coordinates.
It really shows how a seemingly simple question about a plastic disc touches on these incredibly deep legal, philosophical, and even scientific issues. Your curiosity really peeled back the layers.
It exposed fundamental tensions between what we expect when we acquire creative works and what the current legal and technological systems actually deliver. Often, it's not true ownership, but limited, fragile permission.
So the final thought maybe is this. In this universe of constant flux where ownership is a construct and permanence an illusion, what does it really mean to own anything? A disc, a file, an idea?
And perhaps more importantly, are there better ways? Models focused on access, fairness, stewardship, and respecting both creators and users, rather than clinging to outdated notions of absolute permanent property.
Something for all of us to think about next time we click buy or slide a disc into a player. Keep digging into these questions.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been fascinating.
Catch you next time.